Hello, my name is Jeff Enright, and I'm a Senior Maritime Project Manager with Search and a Qualified Marine Archaeologist, or QMA. Search is a cultural resources management firm, and we assisted Equinor with the identification of potential submerged historic properties within the Empire Wind project location. We'll define the term historic property in a future slide, but for simplicity and understanding, we'll simply refer to them as archaeological resources throughout this presentation. We're going to talk today about required training for the Unanticipated Discoveries Plan, or UDP, for archaeological resources. You might see this also referred to as a post-review discoveries plan, and our discussion about it today is required training for any construction contractor working on the installation, operation and maintenance, or decommissioning of the Empire Wind project. Equinor hired Search to navigate the project through federal and state cultural resources regulations and environmental permitting. The primary requirement of compliance is to identify archaeological resources that could be impacted by the project. Once resources were identified, Search worked with Equinor to achieve avoidance and minimization of impacts to archaeological resources or mitigation for those that could not be avoided. Our identification of archaeological resources is based primarily upon interpretation of geophysical data, including magnetometer, side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiler, seismic, and multi-beam echo sounder instruments. For a project of this size, it is not a guarantee that analysis of geophysical data alone will identify all archaeological resources on the seafloor within the Empire Wind footprint. Therefore, we develop a plan of action and protocol for what to do if an unanticipated archaeological discovery is made during seafloor disturbing activities. This is the UDP, and it requires your participation during your involvement with the project. Your UDP training today is codified in a memorandum of agreement between Equinor, federal and state agencies, and other interested project stakeholders. Not everything presented today will necessarily relate to your specific task on the Empire Wind project, and the type of work you may be conducting might have minimal risk of encountering unanticipated archaeological discoveries. But it takes a watchful eye from all involved throughout the life of the project to help us identify potential archaeological material on the seafloor. Therefore, this training is mandatory. It is important to understand that archaeological sites are non-renewable resources that deserve the same considerations and protection as other natural resources that could be impacted by seafloor development. They have particular interest and meaning to groups of people and are sometimes the only physical remains of our maritime heritage. Once we lose this resource, we lose our ability to learn about our past, and even minimal impact to an archaeological site can endanger archaeological interpretation. If an unanticipated archaeological discovery is made, further archaeological investigation will occur, and the level of impact at the time of discovery will have a direct effect on the quality of data obtainable during this future investigation. So the take-home message for this training is that if you see potential archaeological material during seafloor disturbing activities, then stop work immediately to prevent further negative impact and start the notification process. Equinor has a lease agreement with the federal government that includes a notification stipulation for archaeological discoveries that begins the moment a potential submerged archaeological site or materials identified. Initial notification must be made within 24 hours with follow-up written report within 72 hours. And this includes after the fact discoveries. So for example, if a potential archaeological site is not recognized during construction, but you noticed it while reviewing ROV video later, then the notification clock starts the moment you view the video. Here is our agenda for the training. We're going to begin with a brief description of what a submerged historic property is, what was identified in the footprint of the Empire Wind project, and the regulatory framework behind the protection of these resources. We will then provide examples of potential unanticipated archaeological discoveries on the seafloor that you should be on the lookout for, and end with a review of the UDP protocol, communication required if a discovery is made, and basic field procedures when potential archaeological material is recovered. Search QMAs completed a marine archaeological resources assessment of geophysical data collected within the Empire Wind footprint to identify archaeological resources. The Empire Wind footprint is referred to in regulatory language as the area of potential effects, which is represented by the black polygons depicted in the images in these next two slides. All seafloor impacts related to the project must remain within this boundary, and Equinor has committed to no seafloor impacts outside this area of potential effects. The first category of submerged historic properties is perhaps what most people think of: shipwrecks. These images here depict geophysical targets that either represent or could represent shipwrecks within the Empire Wind footprint. Because identification is based upon the interpretation of geophysical data and ground truthing has not occurred, the actual sources of these targets remain unknown. Regardless, the regulatory agencies consider search's interpretation of these geophysical targets as submerged historic properties until proven otherwise. As such, Equinor has also committed to avoiding seafloor impacts within an avoidance buffer around each of these geophysical targets, and that includes indirect construction impacts like anchors and anchor lines or spuds and jackup legs. The second category of submerged historic properties is called an Ancient Submerged Landform Feature, or ASLF. These are large geologic landforms that were once exposed as dry land, but because of sea level rise over the last 24,000 years, these features are now buried and submerged on the outer continental shelf. Because they were once dry land, many of them were therefore once inhabited by early North American peoples. Many ASLFs are buried deeply and not in danger of impact from the project, but others are shallowly buried and will be impacted. Not only do they maintain the potential to preserve archaeological sites, but the landscapes themselves are ancestral lands to Native American tribes and hold cultural and religious significance. Seafloor impacts are permitted within these feature boundaries due to mitigation commitments Equinor has made, but there is still the possibility of an unanticipated archaeological discovery related to these features during seafloor impacts. This process is formalized in the environmental review and permitting for the Empire Wind project, as well as stipulated in the executed lease agreement with the federal government. We won't spend a great deal of time on individual regulations, but this slide should illustrate the importance of the process and the protection afforded to these resources. We will briefly touch on the Sunken Military Craft Act. Military shipwrecks and aircraft are property of the U.S. government, regardless of age or location around the globe, and may not be disturbed without permission from the appropriate military branch. Importantly, they could be considered grave sites, as many craft went down with servicemen and women on board who remain on the crash site. The red bullets offer some additional important information that is included in the lease agreement and the environmental permitting documents. If an unanticipated archaeological discovery is made, stop work within 50 meters of that location only. You can continue work elsewhere. Also, note that archaeological site locations are protected by federal and state laws, and it is illegal to divulge the location of any unanticipated archaeological find or geophysical target representing a potential archaeological site associated with the Empire Wind project, including broadcasting or discussing over marine VHF radio channels. Non-compliance with the laws and regulations presented on the previous slide has consequences. Ocean and harbor bottomlands and archaeological sites located on or within them are owned by U.S. or state governments, and intentionally disturbing or looting an archaeological site on federal or state land is a crime. Discovery and inadvertent disturbance of a potential archaeological site is not a crime, but it does have penalties for failure to report in accordance with laws and regulations, including an issue of non-compliance to the project, daily financial penalties, lost time and money while the project navigates the non-compliance process, and the site will remain off limits until the non-compliance issue is resolved through both the Bessie legal process and the BOEM permitting process. While the process plays out, the daily fine could remain in effect, and it doesn't just involve the federal or state government, but other federal and state agencies, the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, Native American tribes, and local governments and historical societies, all of whom have rights as project stakeholders. Each one of them could play a part in the process, and the project's memorandum of agreement defines a timeline of a minimum of 180 days to get through the process, not including any actual archaeological investigation that might be required of the project. And that's only if none of the stakeholders object during the process to resolve the non-compliance. Regardless of schedule, inconvenience, or opinions about archaeology, it's not nearly as inconvenient or costly to comply with laws and regulations as it is for non-compliance. We're going to present common types of archaeological sites and material found on the outer continental shelf, but this is not an exhaustive list of potential archaeological material you might encounter. Humans have inhabited the now submerged OCS for thousands of years and left evidence of that occupation atop the ASLS. And many materials they utilize can survive buried under the seafloor for thousands of years. More recently, our historic maritime use of the OCS dates back centuries. Thousands of shipwrecks are located on the OCS, and debris from these archaeological sites, as well as discarded historic debris, litter the seafloor. The takeaway is that it's not your job to make a positive archaeological identification. If potential cultural material is discovered, start the notification process. The goal is to arm you with enough information to make an informed decision about the potential for archaeological concern. But when in doubt, notify and we'll do the rest. Because there will be construction within the boundaries of some ASLFs, seafloor impacts could result in unanticipated archaeological discovery. So it's important to be vigilant and aware that material on the seafloor related to ASLFs will be more difficult to identify as archaeological than with a shipwreck site. Some types of archaeological material indicative of past human occupation include pottery shards and stone or bone tools. With worked stone, you'll often see chipping, flaking, or multifaceted surfaces like that in the upper right image. There is often a large amount of stone material like this in a single location, which will be a marker for a potential archaeological site. Stone can be altered by humans, but also naturally through seafloor mobility. It takes a lithic expert to recognize the difference, so cease operations if you see stone material like this. You could encounter a dugout canoe, particularly closer to shore where more recent deposition could result in preservation. Often, terrestrial archaeological sites erode from the modern shore into the ocean, so there is a higher potential to encounter archaeological material in shallower water. Cease operations if you think you've found bone, regardless of whether you think it is animal or human. Even if it's not human, it could be associated with an archaeological site. The image here is the mandible from an animal, but illustrates the difficulty differentiating. If it is human, then there are additional required notifications. Law enforcement is notified until a definitive age and verification as archaeological material can be established. Importantly, Archaeological human remains are protected by the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and require special notifications and treatment, including archaeological direction before taking photographs. We'll discuss the notification process in a little more detail, but understand that it is not your responsibility to call law enforcement or the U.S. Coast Guard or the state medical examiner. That decision will be made by Equinor and the QMA if it's deemed necessary. Shipwrecks come in a wide variety of construction materials and techniques. If you discover a potential vessel hull on the seafloor, report it regardless of assumed age or origin. All shipwrecks must be reported for analysis by a QMA. Importantly, a shipwreck could be considered a gravesite if human remains are associated, something that only additional archaeological investigation can determine. Wooden hull vessels can be degraded and difficult to recognize. Vertical framing can be splayed to the point of horizontal or jumbled up on the seafloor. Many shipwrecks are not as well organized as these images, so any indication of a pattern once resembling parallel and regularly spaced timbers could indicate the presence of a wooden hulled shipwreck. These are ROV images of a small wooden hulled vessel located during an Empire Wind seafloor inspection following environmental permitting. This vessel did not produce a geophysical target that would indicate a potential shipwreck at this location. Therefore, it was not identified as an area for avoidance during the archaeological assessment. It is an unanticipated archaeological discovery and illustrates the difficulty in recognizing a shipwreck on the seafloor using only geophysical data. It also illustrates that unanticipated archaeological discoveries do occur, and it takes your vigilance to help us recognize them. Ballast is weight added to the bottom of a ship to keep the vessel upright and improve sailing qualities. It's often comprised of fist-sized stones or slightly larger, large pieces of iron, or a combination of both. Ballast piles are often in an elongated pattern and could have associated timbers or artifacts in the vicinity, but they are difficult to identify and easy to overlook, particularly when it's comprised exclusively of stone. Metal machinery outlasts some vessel hulls in the marine environment. Vessel machinery could be discovered in association with a shipwreck or lying seemingly alone on the seafloor due to the burial or deterioration of vessel hull or having been discarded off a historic vessel. It could also be unrecognizable as historic archaeological material due to concretion or marine growth. Shipwrecks come in a wide variety of construction materials, and these archaeological sites contain thousands of associated objects. Material from these sites can be dispersed great distances from their origin by current and storms. It may be obvious that material is associated with a shipwreck, but oftentimes material is resting on the seafloor in the middle of nowhere, having been separated and relocated from a larger shipwreck site. So although you might not be working within the geophysical target avoidance zones we discussed at the beginning, some of your work may be close enough that you could encounter associated material on the seafloor. Isolated anchors on the OCS are very common, as illustrated by two historic anchors found on the Empire Wind project as unanticipated archaeological discoveries and depicted on this slide. Although they are often found isolated, they could be related to a nearby shipwreck and require correlation with other geophysical and archival research data. Historic and modern anchors can be similar, so they need to be reported for QMA analysis regardless of assumed age. Some indications of age include corrosion. Sometimes there will be striations or a grainy appearance to the metal when it's wrought iron, concretion, and marine growth. The image at the bottom center of this slide is a good example of all three. As with anchors, historic and modern fishing gear can be difficult to differentiate. Some indication of historic fishing gear include rope netting, wooden components, and glass floats, as opposed to modern gear comprised of monofilament or polypropylene rope, plastic floats, and often bright paint. Although fishing gear itself is not necessarily archaeologically important, it could be associated with a historic shipwreck or modern gear that is snagged on a historic shipwreck, which occurs often on the OCS. If modern fishing gear must be moved, take caution when moving because it could be snagged on important archaeological material or something that is buried and unseen. Because of the speed at which aircraft impact the ocean during a crash, oftentimes these sites are highly fractured and spread out over relatively great distances. Despite the likely extreme disarticulation, aluminum fuselage and other metal engine components survive well in the marine environment and should be relatively recognizable. Importantly, there is a higher likelihood that an aircraft crash site is a grave site. The UDP should be kept on the vessel. It's a relatively short document that should be reviewed to understand the reasons and protocol for notifications. It also includes this flowchart. This flowchart will also be posted on the vessel and offers an alternative notification infographic that should be quick and easy to follow. The most important takeaway from this training is that communication is key. It's not your responsibility to make an archaeological determination. So when in doubt, stop operations, alert your supervisor, notify the onboard Equinor representative, and then contact will be made with the QMA. Operations will remain suspended until the review process is complete, but only within 50 meters of the location of an unanticipated archaeological discovery. You can work elsewhere. Notice the title of this slide highlights the word bone. Obviously, there are circumstances that warrant an immediate call to law enforcement, such as when soft tissue exists, but what we're talking about today does not. This image is an example of animal bone found on the Empire Wind project that did not require immediate law enforcement notification. It's clean bone that has been submerged long enough to make it difficult to determine its age. Whether human or not, this type of bone does not require immediate notification to law enforcement. Allow the QMA to assess first, and then Equinor will make required notification to law enforcement if warranted. No further work will be allowed at the location for a minimum of 24 hours, so calling folks overnight will not speed up the process. Search employs specialists trained to identify and analyze bone. These specialists will obviously not be on the vessel, nor will they be on call 24 hours a day, so we just need to slow down and let the process play out. They need an opportunity to review the potential bone before it is confiscated by law enforcement if that's the decision made. We may require more information and photos of the find or provide instruction for the transfer of material off the vessel. It's especially important that we get all the information we need before transferring to someone else because the disposal of potential archaeological material by law enforcement or the medical examiner prevents us from acquiring necessary archaeological data. And if the QMA is not given the opportunity to examine the remains, we may not be able to make an archaeological recommendation. The result could be costly and time-consuming archaeological investigation of the location to prove it is not an archaeological site. Plus, there is a potential for non-compliance implications. It is not our intention to turn you into a maritime archaeologist who can provide complete archaeological documentation of cultural material. But sometimes, despite our best efforts, cultural material can disintegrate rapidly once removed from the marine environment, or issues in the chain of custody occur that result in the loss of material. In these cases, the only information that remains for the QMA to assess is what you gather during your initial field documentation. So we're simply asking for a basic level of documentation to assist with our initial 24-hour notification and subsequent reporting if material is damaged or lost or doesn't arrive to us in time to meet reporting deadlines. We're asking for information that will require you to handle potential archaeological material, so obviously be cautious when manipulating objects for photos and documentation. When taking photographs, try to have a solid background color, white is preferred, and include a scale or tape measure in all photos. Or, if a scale or tape measure is not available, include an object in the photos that is easily visible and recognizable and has relatively the same dimensions as something someone can pick up in an office. For example, include a pen or a pencil or a marker in the photograph. When taking photos, isolate the object away from other objects and take multiple photos from multiple angles and capture each side or edge of an object. As with most things, more is better, and using a cell phone camera is fine. We're going to ask you to store artifacts a certain way, but for documentation, it is acceptable and preferred to remove the object from its storage to capture photos. Basic measurements don't need to be exact, but close, and note any unique features, especially features that cannot be captured in a photograph. Please add this information to the Equinor Marine Archeological Unanticipated Discovery reporting form. When providing coordinates, please provide precise coordinates out to 6 decimal places. When finished, store the material completely submerged in salt water and out of the sunlight. When transporting material off the vessel, complete the chain of custody that is provided. Finally, we wanted to remind you that potential archaeological material should never be purposely recovered from the seafloor. Sometimes the inadvertent recovery of archaeological material during construction occurs. But if you identify material on the seafloor, leave it on the seafloor. Do not recover material to the vessel. If something inadvertently comes on deck, keep it sealed and wet. We also wanted to include some good reference material for any vessel library. These books in particular offer a lot of illustrations and descriptions of some of the material we discussed today, as well as much more that was not discussed. They are good resources when confronted with potential archaeological material on the seafloor that may be out of context or unrecognizable. Thank you for your time, and be safe.